Welcome to the Two Beans in a Pod.
Great to be here.
So today we're doing a deep dive based on source material from Jack Posobiec's book, Unhumans, History of Communist Revolutions. Specifically, excerpts provided by a listener.
Right, and our goal isn't to endorse or refute, but really just to unpack the main arguments Posobiec makes in these sources.
Exactly. We want to lay out his ideas about certain movements, historical revolutions, and, well, the modern parallels he draws. Understand his framework, basically.
Let's start with the core concept then, this idea of unhumans.
Yeah, what exactly does Posobiec mean by that? He seems quite careful with the definition.
He is. He says it's not a race, not a distinct group like that, but a type of person, someone within Homo sapiens.
Okay, a type defined by what?
According to Posobiec, it's defined by, well, grievance, misery, and a kind of nihilism, a drive to destroy human society.
Destroy it. So it's about rejecting everything.
Pretty much. Posobiec argues they place themselves outside humanity by rejecting human rights for others. Their goal, he claims, is to either convert everyone to their view or just destroy what they can't convert.
And how does this connect to, say, communism or leftism in his view?
Well, here's a key point from this source. Posobiec argues that communism and leftism aren't really ideologies in the traditional sense.
Not about economics or social theory?
Not primarily, no. He presents them more as tactics of warfare aimed solely at taking power.
Tactics. Like how?
He talks about micro-revolutions and irregular warfare, things happening in what he calls a fifth-generation warfare gray zone.
Okay, what does that mean, gray zone warfare?
It's sort of conflict below the threshold of actual declared war, using political disruption, information warfare, social manipulation, that kind of thing, blurring the lines.
Right, makes sense. And he links this to another concept, anarcho-tyranny. Sounds contradictory.
It does, yeah. But Posobiec defines it very specifically. It's the selective over-enforcement of laws against one group,
while simultaneously under-enforcing them, or not enforcing them at all, against another group.
Exactly. Selective law application to control populations.
Does he give examples of this?
He does. He brings up the events around George Floyd's death, focusing on specific details from the autopsy, the jurors' actions, things he claims were ignored because of an existing oppressor versus oppressed narrative.
So he's arguing the outcome was predetermined by the narrative?
That's his claim, yeah. That institutions shaping the narrative decided the public perception in advance. He also points to police-free zones like Chait Shop as selective non-enforcement.
And the St. Louis couple case.
Right, as an example, in his view, of selective over-enforcement against people defending their property while others broke laws nearby. It's about how laws are used or not used.
Okay, so how does he think these situations are prepared? He uses a military framework, right? OPE.
Yes, operational preparation of the environment, OPE. It's about shaping the battlefield, both physical and human terrain beforehand.
Setting the state.
Precisely. To minimize surprises for the side taking action. And he breaks it down into stages. Stage 1 is separation messaging,
Which involves?
convincing target groups they're oppressed, that their suffering is real, unfair, and crucially, that someone else is to blame. It's about manufacturing or amplifying grievance.
And he argues this relies more on emotion than facts.
Yeah, he uses the incident with the Native American man and the student as an example where he claims the narrative was set before the facts, driven by infiltrated institutions that control society's mental model.
Okay, what about stage 3? He seems to skip stage 2 in the excerpts, but stage 3 is infiltration.
Right. Stage 3 is about gaining actual power. According to Posobiec, this happens either by infiltrating existing institutions
Get inside.
or by building parallel dual power structures that weaken the old ones. He says this is critical because it lets the revolutionaries, or unhumans as he calls them, punch down with real authority.
And he sees historical precedents for this infiltration.
Definitely. He points to the Bolsheviks infiltrating the Soviets in Russia, undermining the church. In Spain, he mentions communists using things like cultural exchanges as cover for Soviet connections.
And China.
The CCP, he argues, built trust with peasants and professionals, formed alliances like the United Fronts, all while planning to take over later. Cozy up, then backstab when you have the advantage. That's the pattern he identifies.
So the preparation is where the real battle is fought, in this view.
That's his argument. Win before the fight even seems to begin.
Now, Posobiec looks at a whole sweep of history. The French Revolution, Haitian, Russian, Spanish Civil War, Cuba, Cambodia, many others. He sees common threads.
Yes, recurring patterns, like systematically targeting the existing power structures, church, aristocracy, military, landowners.
And using grievances class warfare, have-nots versus haves.
Absolutely. Plus a grim pattern of using terror, purges, destroying historical symbols to erase the past and control the present.
And the revolution turning on itself.
Yeah, that's a major theme he highlights. Bolsheviks versus Mensheviks, Spanish factions fighting each other, Mao's Cultural Revolution, the Khmer Rouge. Internal purges seem common.
External support is also key in his analysis, like Soviet or Chinese backing.
He presents it as a frequent factor, yes, enabling these movements.
And the ultimate goal, despite the rhetoric, is just power.
That's Posobiec's conclusion from the historical analysis. Power for the group, driving the revolution.
Which brings us to the present day and the U.S.
Yeah.
He argues these same patterns are playing out now.
He does. He calls it a gray zone communist revolution happening in America using updated tactics.
So events like January 6th, how does he frame that?
Interestingly, he calls it an inverse Bastille, something of an anomaly, not typical the modern tactics he focuses on, which are usually non-kinetic.
So what are the typical modern tactics, according to him?
Micro-revolutions and network swarms, using social media, manipulating narratives, cyber warfare, essentially.
To do what?
To neutralize targets without violence. Debanking, deplatforming, ruining reputations, creating fear, self-censorship. He mentioned Scott Adams as an example.
Okay, that's the tactical side. What about the ideological framing? He uses the term cultural Marxism.
Right. He argues this aims to replace unity with a focus on group differences, race, gender, etc., treating people as representatives of oppressor or oppressed groups.
And he critiques identity categories themselves.
Yeah, he uses Hispanic as an example of what he sees as an artificial category built for grievance politics, grouping diverse people together.
He also looks critically at the civil rights movement narrative.
He argues the common narrative is oversimplified, leading some to view all of American history as just oppressor versus oppressed, which he claims fuels radicalism and destroying symbols.
And he brings up things like the Moynihan Report.
Yes, linking it to discussions about family structure and also the Cloward-Piven strategy about overwhelming welfare systems. He sees these as contributing factors to current issues.
What about universities? He claims they were infiltrated.
Back in the 60s, he argues, due to expansion, draft-dodging motives, hiring practices, leading to the current academic culture he critiques.
Which leads to a really controversial claim. McCarthy was right.
That's his assertion, yeah. That McCarthy, despite his flawed methods, was actually identifying real communist infiltration in government, Hollywood, education. That the Red Scare wasn't entirely baseless, according to Posobiec.
Okay, quite the analysis. Before we get into how Posobiec suggests opposing these forces, just a quick reminder, if you're finding this deep dive valuable, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us out.
Definitely. Okay, so if that's the problem analysis from Posobiec, what's the proposed solution? How does he say people should respond?
Well, the first thing is action. He's very clear. No one is coming to save us. It is up to us. No passivity.
And he mentions the great men of history idea.
He does, suggesting that sometimes when institutions fail, decisive leaders, he gives examples like Franco or Caesar, might be needed. It's framed as a response to institutional collapse.
A controversial point, but noted. What about specific tactics for everyday people or groups?
The core principle he advocates is exact reciprocity, the iron law. Basically, use their tactics against them.
How so?
Things like naming and shaming, repurposing struggle session ideas, maybe supporting things like Professor Watchlist, also reciprocal lawfare.
Using the courts back?
Yeah. Countersuing, state AGs prosecuting activist groups, using archaea laws against organizations allegedly profiting from illegal activities.
And boycotts.
Organized, sustained boycotts. He uses the Bud Light example, but stresses you have to stick with it. Beyond tactics, does he propose bigger systemic changes?
Yes. Things like a National Tax Transparency Act, so people can see where federal money goes, potentially to expose funding of subversive activity, as he puts it.
Voting system transparency, too.
Right, using tech so voters can verify their vote was counted. Also, ideas around compassionate capitalism, treating employees well to prevent unrest and fixing higher education.
Fixing higher ed how?
Ideas like addressing student debt, maybe through endowments or bankruptcy changes, tuition refunds for poor education quality, and even encouraging a baby boom demographically.
Okay, and finally, he outlines counter-OPE stages for individuals.
Yeah, mirroring the OPE stages. Stage 1, separate. Build your own network, support aligned businesses and media, maybe homeschool or find alternative education.
Stage 2, mock.
Mock, ridicule, disgrace the unhumans, as he terms them. Decide ahead of time how to handle cancel mobs. And his advice is never apologize.
Controversial again. And stage 3.
Infiltrate or build alternatives. Either get involved in existing institutions to change them, local government, school boards, or build completely new things. Co-ops, businesses, decentralized structures. Use counter boycotts, recall campaigns. Adapt based on whether the old system seems salvageable.
So a very direct confrontational approach overall.
That seems to be the core message, yes. Pasobi concludes, quite starkly, the Unhumans will not stop until they are stopped, and we must stop them.
But he does offer some timeline, hope.
He suggests it's possible, maybe over a long time frame, like 20 to 40 years, based on historical cycles.
Well, that certainly covers the main arguments presented in the Pasobiec source material we looked at today. A very specific framework for viewing history and current events.
Definitely a distinct perspective.
So the final thought we want to leave you with, drawn from this source, if, as Pasobi argues, these historical revolutionary tactics, OPE and anarcho-tyranny, are identifiable patterns used by groups he calls unhumans. And if he's right that these are being applied today through things like network swarms and cultural shifts, well, what responsibility does his framework imply individuals might have to recognize these patterns and maybe even use the counter methods he proposes?
A challenging question posed by the source material itself. What role, if any, does the individual play in identifying and potentially countering these forces within their own communities?
Something to consider. Thank you for listening to Two Beans in a Pod. If you are interested in the book, please order it from the link below.
And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed the deep dive.